As Deputy Nathan Reed firmly guided her toward the patrol car, Sophia's legs buckled beneath her. She stumbled, her sneakers scraping against the pavement, but Nathan's unyielding grip on her arm kept her from falling. The late afternoon sun glinted off the car's polished exterior, and as Nathan opened the back door, Sophia caught her reflection in the tinted window. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her eyes wide and brimming with terror. "Get in," Deputy Reed ordered, his tone gruff and devoid of empathy. His hand remained firm on her shoulder as she hesitated. The moment the door slammed shut behind her, Sophia felt the weight of the situation settle over her like a suffocating blanket. From the back seat, the world outside seemed like a warped painting, the bright colors of neighborhood homes and sunlit trees blurred by her tears. A distant bird chirped as the car engine roared to life, but its cheerful melody felt mocking in the face of Sophia's turmoil. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly alone. Her father wasn't there to comfort her, and the thought of him being unaware of her situation made her stomach churn. As the patrol car began its slow drive away from the curb, she huddled into herself, her slender frame trembling with every sob. Her chest heaved as waves of memories washed over her, memories of moments that had seemed like fleeting injustices, but now painted a clearer, starker picture. She thought back to the day in 5th grade when her teacher had called her answer unexpectedly advanced, or the time at the shopping mall when a security guard had shadowed her for several aisles while she browsed the store. "You're just imagining it," her dad had told her then, trying to shield her from the cruelty of the world. But now, sitting in the cold, sterile back seat of a police car, those moments felt far too real to ignore. This wasn't just an offhand comment or a judgmental glance. This was real, visceral, and terrifying. The station came into view, a monolithic, gray building surrounded by chain-link fences and patrol cars. It loomed like an impassable fortress, making Sophia's pulse quicken with dread. As Deputy Reed opened the door and gestured for her to step out, her knees wobbled beneath her once more, and her sneakers dragged against the pavement as she was ushered inside. The fluorescent lights inside the station were harsh, buzzing faintly in the silence that greeted them. The receptionist barely glanced up as Nathan led her past rows of desks and humming computers. Conversations halted, heads turned, and for a moment Sophia felt like an exhibit on display. Her cheeks burned and her wrists ached from the handcuffs, which had rubbed her skin raw. "Wait here," Nathan said curtly, as he guided her into a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Sophia sat down, her body rigid with tension. Her cheeks were stiff with dried tears, her lips trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. She stared at the door, waiting for someone, anyone, to come back and explain why this was happening. Minutes felt like hours until the door creaked open again. A female officer stepped inside, her face a mixture of professionalism and a vague semblance of sympathy. "We're giving you one phone call," she said, her voice flat. She motioned toward a wall-mounted phone across the room. Sophia stood slowly, her legs barely holding her up. She picked up the receiver with trembling hands, the cold plastic feeling foreign in her grip. Her fingers quivered as she dialed her father's number, a sequence as familiar to her as her own name. She held her breath as the phone rang once, then twice. "Hello!" Her father's voice, deep and reassuring, came through the line. Hearing his voice was like a dam breaking. Fresh tears streamed down Sophia's face as she choked out, "Dad, it's me!" "Sophia? What's wrong? Where are you?" His voice shifted immediately from calm to sharp with concern. "I'm at the police station," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They arrested me." "What?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "Arrested? What happened? Are you hurt?" Sophia swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. "It's the phone you gave me," she managed to say. "They thought I stole it." On the other end of the line, there was a pause, and then her father's voice returned, firm and resolute. "Stay where you are, Sophia. I'm coming to get you. Everything will be okay. I promise." As the line went dead, Sophia clung to the echo of his words like a lifeline. Her father would come for her. He always did. I'll continue the reimagined narrative in the next section. Here's the continuation of the story, maintaining the depth and expanding where appropriate. Miles away, Dr. Ethan Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his SUV so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced as he replayed Sophia's trembling voice on the phone, each word cutting deeper into his heart. His daughter was at the police station, his sweet, brilliant little girl. It was unthinkable. The road ahead blurred slightly, his vision clouded by a mix of fury and helplessness. He hit the gas pedal, his car roaring down the suburban streets toward the station. As he drove, memories of similar injustices crept into his mind, unbidden and relentless, each one feeding the storm brewing inside him. He thought of the time Sophia had come home from middle school in tears because another student had called her a thief after her science project won first place. Then, there was the day at the community pool when a lifeguard had assumed she didn't know how to swim and had insisted she leave the deep end. Ethan had brushed these incidents aside back then, trying to protect Sophia from the painful realities of the world. People can be ignorant, he'd told her, but you know who you are, and that's all that matters. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly alone. Her father wasn't there to comfort her, and the thought of him being unaware of her situation made her stomach churn. As the patrol car began its slow drive away from the curb, she huddled into herself, her slender frame trembling with every sob. Her chest heaved as waves of memories washed over her, memories of moments that had seemed like fleeting injustices, but now painted a clearer, starker picture. She thought back to the day in 5th grade when her teacher had called her answer unexpectedly advanced, or the time at the shopping mall when a security guard had shadowed her for several aisles while she browsed the store. "You're just imagining it," her dad had told her then, trying to shield her from the cruelty of the world. But now, sitting in the cold, sterile back seat of a police car, those moments felt far too real to ignore. This wasn't just an offhand comment or a judgmental glance. This was real, visceral, and terrifying. The station came into view, a monolithic gray building surrounded by chain-link fences and patrol cars. It loomed like an impassable fortress, making Sophia's pulse quicken with dread. As Deputy Reed opened the door and gestured for her to step out, her knees wobbled beneath her once more, and her sneakers dragged against the pavement as she was ushered inside. The fluorescent lights inside the station were harsh, buzzing faintly in the silence that greeted them. The receptionist barely glanced up as Nathan led her past rows of desks and humming computers. Conversations halted, heads turned, and for a moment Sophia felt like an exhibit on display. Her cheeks burned, and her wrists ached from the handcuffs, which had rubbed her skin raw. "Wait here," Nathan said curtly as he guided her into a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Sophia sat down, her body rigid with tension. Her cheeks were stiff with dried tears, her lips trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. She stared at the door, waiting for someone, anyone, to come back and explain why this was happening. Minutes felt like hours until the door creaked open again. A female officer stepped inside, her face a mixture of professionalism and a vague semblance of sympathy. "We're giving you one phone call," she said, her voice flat. She motioned toward a wall-mounted phone across the room. Sophia stood slowly, her legs barely holding her up. She picked up the receiver with trembling hands, the cold plastic feeling foreign in her grip. Her fingers quivered as she dialed her father's number, a sequence as familiar to her as her own name. She held her breath as the phone rang once, then twice. "Hello?" Her father's voice, deep and reassuring, came through the line. Hearing his voice was like a dam breaking. Fresh tears streamed down Sophia's face as she choked out, "Dad, it's me." "Sophia? What's wrong? Where are you?" His voice shifted immediately, from calm to sharp with concern. "I'm at the police station," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They arrested me." "What?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "Arrested? What happened? Are you hurt?" Sophia swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. "It's the phone you gave me," she managed to say. "They thought I stole it." On the other end of the line, there was a pause, and then her father's voice returned, firm and resolute. "Stay where you are, Sophia. I'm coming to get you. Everything will be okay. I promise." As the line went dead, Sophia clung to the echo of his words like a lifeline. Her father would come for her. He always did. I'll continue the reimagined narrative in the next section. Here's the continuation of the story, maintaining the depth and expanding where appropriate. Miles away, Dr. Ethan Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his SUV so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced as he replayed Sophia's trembling voice on the phone, each word cutting deeper into his heart. His daughter was at the police station, his sweet, brilliant little girl. It was unthinkable. The road ahead blurred slightly, his vision clouded by a mix of fury and helplessness. He hit the gas pedal, his car roaring down the suburban streets toward the station. As he drove, memories of similar injustices crept into his mind, unbidden and relentless, each one feeding the storm brewing inside him. He thought of the time Sophia had come home from middle school in tears because another student had called her a thief after her science project won first place. Then there was the day at the community pool when a lifeguard had assumed she didn't know how to swim and had insisted she leave the deep end. Ethan had brushed these incidents aside back then, trying to protect Sophia from the painful realities of the world. "People can be ignorant," he told her, "but you know who you are, and that's all that matters." But now, as he sped toward the station, those moments didn't feel so small. They felt like warning signs he had tried to ignore, little flashes of a much bigger problem. This time was different. This wasn't a passing comment or an ugly misunderstanding. His daughter was sitting in a police station, handcuffed, accused of theft simply for existing in her own neighborhood. "Not this time," he muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. "Not my Sophia." The police station came into view, its chain-link fence glinting in the setting sun. Ethan pulled into the parking lot, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He parked haphazardly, barely registering whether his car was within the lines, and stepped out with purpose. Every step toward the entrance felt like he was stepping into a battlefield. The automatic doors whooshed open, revealing the stark interior of the station. The buzz of activity inside dimmed slightly as people turned to look at him, a tall man in his early 40s, dressed sharply in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, his face a mask of fury barely contained. Ethan approached the front desk, where a young officer sat typing something into a computer. "I'm here to see my daughter, Sophia Hayes," Ethan said, his voice tight and controlled. The officer glanced up, his expression bored. "You'll need to fill out this form and wait." Ethan slammed his hand down on the counter, making the officer jump. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm not filling out forms. I'm not waiting. My daughter was wrongfully detained, and I want to see her now." The sharpness in his tone caused a ripple of movement in the room. Other officers glanced over, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Ethan's eyes burned as he glared at the man behind the desk, who now seemed visibly uncomfortable. "Sir, please lower your voice," the officer said, his hand hovering over a button on the desk. "Lower my voice?" Ethan barked, his voice echoing through the station. "My daughter is 14 years old. She was handcuffed and dragged here because someone thought she looked suspicious with a phone I bought her. I will not lower my voice until someone explains why this happened." An older officer, his badge identifying him as Sergeant Bradley, approached the commotion. He held up a hand, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, let's take a step back. What's your daughter's name again?" "Sophia Hayes," Ethan replied, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. Sergeant Bradley nodded, glancing at the younger officer. "Get her file," he ordered. The officer scurried off, leaving Ethan standing at the counter, his chest heaving with every breath. "Now," Ethan said, his voice icy, "I want to speak to the officer who arrested her." Sergeant Bradley hesitated. That would be Deputy Reed. Let me see if he's available. Ethan's glare hardened. Make him available. The story continues to unfold in the next section. Stay tuned. Minutes later, Deputy Reed entered the room. His gait was slow, deliberate, and his expression remained neutral, though a faint tension around his eyes betrayed discomfort. Ethan turned to face him, his stance rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're Deputy Reed?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. "That's right," Reed replied, his tone clipped. "I was the arresting officer." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes boring into the deputy's. "Then you're the one who owes me an explanation. Why exactly did you handcuff my daughter and bring her here?" Reed shifted his weight uncomfortably. "We had a report of a stolen phone in the area. Sophia matched the description. Young, female, holding a recently acquired phone." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Matched the description?" he repeated, his voice rising. "What description is that exactly? Young and female? Or young, female, and black?" Reed stiffened. "Sir, we were acting on credible information. The phone matched." "No, it didn't," Ethan snapped, cutting him off. "The phone didn't match anything because I bought that phone for her. Brand new, with my hard-earned money. Did you bother to ask her any questions, or did you just see her and decide she looked guilty?" Reed opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "You didn't ask her who she was. You didn't check her story. You saw a young black girl with a nice phone, and you assumed she must have stolen it. Admit it." "Sir, please," Reed began, but his voice faltered under Ethan's fiery glare. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Ethan demanded. "Explain it to me. Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like you targeted my daughter for no reason other than the color of her skin." The room was silent. Officers nearby paused their work to listen, and a few exchanged uneasy glances. Reed's face flushed, and he looked down at the floor, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice dropping to a quieter, more dangerous tone. "You traumatized my child today. You made her feel like a criminal in her own neighborhood. Do you have any idea what that does to a young girl, the damage you've caused?" Reed's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was following protocol," he said finally, though the words sounded hollow, even to him. "Protocol?" Ethan scoffed, throwing his hands in the air. "Since when is racial profiling part of your protocol?" "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down," Reed said, though his voice lacked authority. Ethan took a step closer, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "Do not tell me to calm down. You don't get to be the one who's uncomfortable here, not after what you put my daughter through." Before the situation could escalate further, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Gentlemen." Both men turned to see Chief Mark Davis, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, standing in the doorway. His presence commanded the room, and the officers nearby immediately returned to their tasks, though their ears remained tuned to the unfolding drama. "Dr. Hayes," Chief Davis said, addressing Ethan directly, "I understand you're upset and you have every right to be. But let's take this discussion somewhere private." Ethan hesitated, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, let's talk." The story continues to develop in the next section. Stay tuned. Here's the next section of the narrative. Chief Davis led Ethan into a conference room with frosted glass walls and a heavy wooden table at its center. As the door clicked shut behind them, Davis gestured for Ethan to take a seat. Ethan remained standing, his arms crossed, his posture defiant. "Look," Davis began, his tone measured. "I know you're angry, and I don't blame you. If it were my child, I'd feel the same way. But I need you to help me understand exactly what happened here." Ethan took a slow, steadying breath before speaking. "What happened?" he said, his voice low and controlled. "Is that one of your deputies arrested my daughter for walking home with a phone I gave her. He didn't ask questions, didn't investigate, didn't treat her like a human being. He just assumed she was guilty." Davis nodded thoughtfully. I've spoken with Deputy Reed, and while I don't condone his actions, I need to understand more about what led to this situation. We received a report of a stolen phone. Stop right there, Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't start justifying this. I don't care what report you got. My daughter did nothing wrong. She's a straight A student, a kind, thoughtful kid. And today, she learned that in the eyes of your department, none of that matters. She learned that no matter how good she is, people will still see her as a suspect first. Davis's expression softened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Doctor, Hayes, I hear you, and I agree. What happened today was unacceptable. I'm not here to defend it. I'm here to fix it. Ethan's jaw tightened. Fix it? How do you fix the fact that my daughter cried herself hoarse in the back of your patrol car? How do you fix the fact that she'll never feel safe walking home again? The chief held his gaze, his tone calm but resolute. We can't undo the harm that's been done, but we can take responsibility, make changes, and ensure this doesn't happen again. I give you my word on that. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Your word? Forgive me if I'm not inclined to trust it. At that moment, the door opened, and a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. Ethan? Ethan turned, his eyes widening in surprise. Standing in the doorway was John Carter, an old friend from his college days, and now, apparently, the deputy chief of police. John's face was a mixture of recognition and regret. John, Ethan said, his voice softening slightly. What are you doing here? John stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I came as soon as I heard. I had no idea it was Sophia until Chief Davis briefed me. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I can't imagine what you're going through. Ethan's shoulders sagged, some of the fire in his eyes dimming as he processed this unexpected reunion. I didn't even know you worked here, he said quietly. I've been with the department for about 10 years, John replied. And believe me, I'm as outraged as you are about what happened. That's not how we're supposed to do things. Ethan studied his old friend's face, searching for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. Then help me, he said simply. Help me make this right. This sets up a shift in tone as old connections emerge and the stakes become personal for more than just Ethan and Sophia. Stay tuned for the continuation. Here's the next section of the story. John took a seat across from Ethan, his expression earnest. I want to help, he said firmly. But first, I need you to walk me through what happened, from Sophia's perspective. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the back of his chair. She was walking home from school, he began, excited about the new phone I gave her, a reward for all her hard work this semester. Then your deputy decided she looked suspicious. He accused her of stealing the phone, handcuffed her, and threw her in the back of a patrol car. No explanation, no chance to defend herself, just humiliation. John winced, rubbing a hand across his jaw. And she told him the phone was hers? She tried, Ethan said bitterly. But he didn't listen. Apparently, protocol doesn't include treating a scared child with respect. John turned to Chief Davis, his tone sharp. Where's Deputy Reed now? Davis sighed. I asked him to step out for the rest of the day. I needed to de-escalate before things got out of hand. Out of hand? Ethan said, his voice rising. This isn't about keeping things tidy for your department. This is about my daughter being treated like a criminal for no reason. John raised a hand, trying to calm his old friend. Ethan, I hear you. I do. And we'll address Reed's behavior. But we also need to look at the bigger picture. This isn't just about one deputy. It's about a system that allows this kind of profiling to happen in the first place. Ethan's eyes narrowed. And what are you going to do about that, John? Give me platitudes about training and policy updates. That won't erase the damage. John nodded slowly. You're right. It won't. But it's a start. And I promise you, Ethan, I'll personally oversee the review of this case and make sure real changes happen. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, he sat down, his shoulders still tense but his expression slightly less guarded. Fine, he said, but I'm not leaving here until I see Sophia. Davis stood. Let me arrange that, he said, heading for the door. John, stay here with Ethan. I'll bring Sophia in. Meanwhile, in a small holding room, Sophia sat with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The walls felt too close, the air too stale. Her head rested against her knees, her tear-streaked face hidden from view. She jumped when the door creaked open and Chief Davis stepped inside. He knelt down slightly so his face was level with hers. Sophia, he said gently, your dad's here. He's been fighting hard for you. Would you like to see him? Sophia raised her head, her eyes puffy and red. He's here? She whispered, her voice trembling. Davis nodded. He is, and he's not leaving without you. Sophia wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie, then stood shakily. Davis offered her a kind smile and gestured for her to follow him. When they entered the conference room, Ethan sprang to his feet, his expression softening the moment he saw his daughter. Sophia, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dad, Sophia said, her voice breaking as she ran into his arms. He wrapped her in a tight embrace, holding her close as if shielding her from the world. It's okay, Ethan murmured into her hair. You're safe now. I'm here. John watched the scene in silence, his chest tightening as he saw the love and protectiveness in his old friend's eyes. Davis stood to the side, his hands clasped in front of him, allowing the moment to unfold. After a long while, Ethan pulled back slightly, cupping Sophia's face in his hands. Are you okay? He asked, searching her eyes for any sign of lingering fear. Sophia nodded, though her lip quivered. I just want to go home, she whispered. Ethan kissed her forehead. We will, sweetheart. Soon. He turned to Davis and John, his voice firm. But first, we're going to make sure this never happens again. The next section will explore the aftermath and potential changes, ensuring the narrative remains rich and emotional. Stay tuned. Here's the continuation of the story, focusing on the aftermath and growing tensions. Ethan gently guided Sophia to a chair, keeping a protective hand on her shoulder as she sat. Her eyes flicked warily between John and Chief Davis, her posture tense as if she expected another blow to land at any moment. I want answers, Ethan said, his voice cold and steady. What steps are you taking to ensure no other child has to go through this? Chief Davis, still standing near the door, drew in a slow breath. Dr. Hayes, this is not something we take lightly. The incident involving Sophia is unacceptable, and we'll be conducting a thorough investigation into Deputy Reed's actions. An investigation? Ethan's tone sharpened, his hand tightening slightly on Sophia's shoulder. That sounds a lot like bureaucratic delay. My daughter deserves more than a vague promise of action. John leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Ethan, I get where you're coming from. This can't just be swept under the rug. That's why I'm suggesting immediate steps. Reed needs to be placed on leave while we conduct not just an investigation, but a full review of our protocols. Protocols, Ethan repeated bitterly. You keep saying that word like it means something. What kind of protocol trains your officers to see an innocent kid as a criminal? John flinched slightly at the accusation, but his voice remained calm. You're right to hold us accountable, but the truth is this isn't just about training. It's about culture. What's been allowed to fester, unchecked, for far too long. Ethan's expression softened slightly at his old friend's candor, but the fire in his eyes didn't dim. So, what do you plan to do about it? We're going to start with mandatory bias training, John said. Not just for Reed, but for the entire department. We'll also implement stricter guidelines for stops and detentions to prevent situations like this from happening again. Ethan shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. Training won't erase what happened today. It won't take back the fear my daughter felt, the humiliation she endured. No, it won't, John admitted. But it's a step toward ensuring it doesn't happen to someone else's child. Sophia, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "What about me?" she asked, looking directly at Chief Davis. "What happens to me now? Do I just forget this happened?" The room fell silent, the weight of her question hanging heavily in the air. Chief Davis walked over and crouched slightly to meet Sophia's gaze. "Sophia, what happened to you today was wrong. You shouldn't have to forget it. You have every right to be angry and to demand better from us. I can't change what happened, but I promise to make things right, starting with a public apology from this department. And if there's anything else you need, you let us know." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I just want people to see me for who I am," she said softly. "Not what they think I am." Ethan clenched his jaw, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He placed a comforting hand over Sophia's. "You hear that?" he said, looking at both Davis and John. "That's what's at stake here. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about every kid who's ever been made to feel small, scared, or invisible because of someone else's prejudice." John straightened, his expression resolute. "You're right, Ethan, and I won't stop until we've created real change." Chief Davis nodded in agreement. "Starting today, this department will be held to a higher standard. I'll personally ensure that Deputy Reed's actions are investigated thoroughly, and I'll oversee the implementation of new policies. But more than that, we need to rebuild trust with you, your family, and this community." Ethan stood, his posture still tense, but his expression slightly less guarded. "I'll hold you to that," he said, his voice firm. "Because if you fail, I'll make sure everyone knows about it." Chief Davis extended a hand, his face earnest. "You have my word, Doctor." Hayes. Ethan hesitated, then shook his hand briefly. "Come on, Sophia," he said, turning to his daughter. "Let's get out of here." As they left the station, the weight of the day hung heavy between them. But as Ethan guided Sophia to the car, he made a silent vow. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. "And there you were, Sam," Captain Edwards began, his voice tinged with a mixture of admiration and humility. "Standing over me with that determined look in your eyes." He turned to face Doctor Samuel directly, his lips curving into a faint smile that carried the weight of old memories. "You saved my life that night. But it wasn't just your medical skills that made the difference. It was your compassion." The room seemed to still as Edward's words lingered in the air. His gaze swept across those present, each face etched with varying degrees of tension, curiosity, or reflection. He had their attention now, and he wasn't going to squander the opportunity. "I was a white cop," he continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Clinging to prejudices I didn't even realize I had. And there you were, a black doctor treating me with nothing but kindness and care. You didn't see my badge. You didn't see the color of my skin. All you saw was a person in need." His voice caught slightly, and he paused to gather himself. A deep breath steadied him as he pushed forward. "That night changed me. It forced me to look inward and recognize how wrong I had been, how much damage those prejudices could do, not just to others, but to myself. I learned firsthand that the color of someone's skin doesn't define their character or their worth." Captain Edwards turned toward Officer Daniels then, his expression hardening slightly, not with anger, but with resolve. "That experience taught me an important lesson, Daniels. Empathy and understanding are not luxuries in this line of work. They're necessities. We're here to protect and serve all people, no matter their race, their background, or where they come from. Our job isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about building trust and fostering respect in the communities we serve." His words hung in the air, their weight palpable. For a moment, no one spoke. Officer Daniels sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His usually confident demeanor seemed to falter under the scrutiny of Captain Edwards' gaze. Dr. Samuel, sitting beside Juliet, watched Daniels intently. His anger was still simmering just beneath the surface, but he couldn't deny that a shift was beginning. There was a faint glimmer of hope that perhaps this confrontation could spark something meaningful, a chance for real, lasting change. Juliet, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, studied the faces of the men in the room. She was still angry, still hurt, but as she listened to the conversation unfold, she found herself seeing more than just their actions. She saw their humanity, the complicated tangle of flaws, guilt, and the potential for redemption. Her gaze lingered on Officer Daniels for a moment, and she noticed something she hadn't seen before: conflict. Captain Edwards leaned forward slightly, his voice softening but remaining firm. "We all have biases, Daniels. The important thing is recognizing them and actively working to overcome them. What happened today can't be undone, but it can serve as a catalyst for something better." Daniels lifted his head slowly, meeting the captain's gaze. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I never thought about it like that, sir. I always believed I was doing my job, keeping people safe. But now..." He trailed off, his eyes darting toward Juliet briefly before quickly looking away, his shame plain on his face. Dr. Samuel studied him, his emotions a swirling mix of anger, frustration, and reluctant understanding. He wasn't ready to let go of his fury just yet. Justice for Juliet demanded more than just remorse. But he could see the value in this moment. The chance for genuine reflection, perhaps even growth, was rare in situations like these. Juliet, sensing the shift in the room, sat up straighter in her chair. She glanced at her father for reassurance, before turning her gaze to Officer Daniels. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but unwavering. "I was really scared today," she said, her words landing like a blow in the otherwise silent room. Officer Daniels visibly flinched, his jaw tightening as her words pierced the barrier of his defenses. "I didn't understand why you thought I was a thief," Juliet continued. It hurt a lot." Her words were raw, unfiltered, and profoundly honest. They hung in the air, demanding acknowledgement. For the first time, Daniels raised his eyes to meet Juliet's. The vulnerability in her voice seemed to cut through the fog of his shame, forcing him to confront the reality of what he had done. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see how he would respond. Officer Daniels lowered his head, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was beginning to understand. The weight of Juliet's words pressed down on him, cracking the defenses he had instinctively built over the years. His chest rose and fell as he struggled to find the right words, his voice trembling when he finally spoke. I'm sorry," he began, his words faltering as they left his lips. "I never thought about how my actions could affect someone like this. Juliet, I didn't stop to think about how scared and hurt you must have felt." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. His voice grew quieter, heavier. "Dr. Samuel, I owe you an apology too. I put your daughter through something no child should ever experience. I was so caught up in what I thought was right. I didn't stop to think about the consequences of my actions." As Daniels's words filled the room, Dr. Samuel sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He appreciated the apology. It was heartfelt, that much was clear. But his decades of experience had taught him that words alone were never enough. Apologies without action were like raindrops in a storm, too fleeting to create meaningful change. Daniels looked at Dr. Samuel then, his voice breaking slightly. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I see that now. And I am deeply sorry." Dr. Samuel leaned forward, his gaze intense but measured. "Officer Daniels," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "I hear your apology and I believe you mean it. But I need you to understand something. It's not enough to just say you're sorry. Real change requires action." Daniels nodded slowly, the truth of Dr. Samuel's words hitting him hard. "You're right," Daniels said after a long pause. His voice was stronger now, but there was an undertone of vulnerability. "I need to do better. But I'm not sure where to start." Captain Edwards, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. His voice carried a sense of authority but was tinged with a touch of encouragement. "That's where we come in, Daniels," he said, locking eyes with his officer. "We can work together to make sure this never happens again. Not to Juliet, not to anyone." Juliet, who had been listening intently, shifted her gaze between her father, Captain Edwards, and Officer Daniels. The conflicting emotions on her face, pain, pride, and cautious hope, mirrored the complexity of the moment. Captain Edwards leaned forward, his voice filled with determination as he addressed Daniels. "Daniels, it's clear we need to address the root of the problem. I'm recommending that you undergo racial sensitivity and empathy training." Daniels' brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded in agreement, his gaze fixed on the table. Edwards pressed on. "This isn't just about learning policies or reviewing guidelines. It's about understanding people's experiences, seeing the world through their eyes, and recognizing the impact of your actions." Dr. Samuel, seeing an opportunity to emphasize the importance of real change, joined the conversation. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that demanded attention. "If I may add something," he said, turning to Daniels, "it's crucial that you engage with the community in a meaningful way. This isn't about ticking boxes or fulfilling requirements. It's about truly seeing the people you once judged unfairly in a new light." He locked eyes with Daniels, his expression unyielding. "You need to listen to their stories, understand their fears, their struggles, their dreams. Only then can you begin to break down the barriers that led to this situation with my daughter." Daniels nodded again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to do better," he said. "I never want to make someone feel the way I made Juliet feel. If this is what it takes to become a better officer and a better person, then I'm willing to do it." Captain Edwards nodded approvingly at Daniels' response, though his expression remained serious. "That's a good start, Daniels," he said. "We'll work out the details of the training and community engagement program. This won't be easy, but it's necessary, not just for you, but for the department as a whole." Daniels took a deep breath, the weight of his commitment settling on him. He turned to Juliet, his eyes filled with remorse. "Juliet," he began, his voice softer now, "I want to apologize to you again. What I did was wrong and I can't take it back, but I am truly sorry for the hurt I caused you." Juliet met his gaze, her face still carrying traces of the pain she had endured, but there was a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. Daniels continued, his voice trembling slightly as he laid bare his regret. "My actions weren't just unfair. They were harmful. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and that's not okay. I can see now how much pain I caused you, and I am deeply sorry for that. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing. What happened today opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect. It's made me realize that I've probably hurt others in the same way without even knowing it." Juliet sat quietly, her gaze steady and unflinching. She didn't respond right away, but her posture shifted slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing as she processed his words. Daniels pressed on, his tone unwavering. "I know that words aren't enough. I have a lot of work to do. But I promise you, Juliet, I'll do better. I'll work hard to confront my biases and become the kind of officer who protects and serves everyone equally." Dr. Samuel watched his daughter closely, his protective instincts on high alert. He could see the sincerity in Daniel's words, but he kept his focus on Juliet, waiting for her to decide how she felt about the apology. Finally, Juliet spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm, each word deliberate. "It still hurts," she said, "but I can see you're trying. I forgive you." Daniel's breath hitched as her words sank in. He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely audible. Dr. Samuel placed a gentle hand on Juliet's shoulder, his pride in her evident. He turned to Daniels, his tone firm but not without warmth. "What you did was wrong," he said plainly. "But I can see you're making a genuine effort to change. I appreciate that. I forgive you too. But remember, this is just the beginning of your journey. There's a lot of work to be done, not just by you, but by this entire system." Captain Edwards stood, his expression resolute. "And that's exactly what we're working on," he said. He turned to Dr. Samuel, placing a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "Sam, I give you my word that I'll personally oversee Daniel's progress and make sure the department takes the steps necessary to earn back the trust we've lost." Dr. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that, John," he said, using the captain's first name for the first time since the ordeal began. "But understand, I'll be watching. This isn't just about Juliet. It's about ensuring no other child goes through what she did." Captain Edwards held his gaze, his voice steady. "I know, Sam, and I promise you, we'll do better." Over the next few days, Officer Daniels took his first tentative steps into the racial sensitivity training program. He entered the community center with a mix of trepidation and determination, unsure of what to expect. The room was filled with unfamiliar faces, and Daniels felt a pang of discomfort as he realized he was no longer in control. A kind-faced woman approached him, her hand outstretched. "Officer Daniels?" she asked. "I'm Marlene Johnson, one of the community leaders running this program. We're glad you're here." Daniels shook her hand, his grip firm but tentative. "Thank you," he murmured, unsure of what else to say. As the sessions began, Daniels found himself struggling to keep an open mind. The stories shared by community members were raw, unflinching, and often deeply critical of law enforcement. His initial reaction was defensive. He wanted to explain, to argue, to insist that not all officers were like that. But as the days went on, something began to shift. Daniels stopped speaking and started listening. One afternoon, during a role-playing exercise, Daniels found himself in the position of a young black man being stopped by the police. The instructors took him through every step of the encounter, mimicking the tone and body language often used in such situations. By the end of the exercise, Daniels was visibly shaken. I didn't realize," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't understand how it felt. The fear, the powerlessness." "That's why we're here," Marlene said gently. "Understanding is the first step toward change." Outside of the training sessions, Daniels began volunteering at the Westside Youth Center as part of his commitment to community engagement. The first time he stepped through the center's doors, he was met with wary eyes and palpable mistrust. Ms. Ramirez, the center's director, greeted him with a cautious smile. "Officer Daniels, welcome. The kids are just finishing up their homework. Why don't you join them?" Daniels nodded, his throat tightening as he made his way to a table where a group of teens sat working on assignments. He pulled up a chair, his hands clasped in his lap. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked. One boy looked up, his expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" he asked bluntly. Daniels hesitated, then replied simply, "I'm here to help, if you'll let me." The first few weeks were difficult. The kids kept their distance, their conversations with him short and clipped. Daniels felt the weight of their mistrust and the realization that he had to earn their respect, step by step. One afternoon, as Officer Daniels helped a young girl with her math homework at the youth center, he overheard a heated conversation nearby. A group of boys sat at a table, their voices rising in frustration as they recounted a recent encounter with the police. "They didn't even ask us anything," one boy exclaimed, his fists clenched. "They just told us to sit down and searched our bags like we were criminals." Another boy chimed in, his tone bitter. "We were just walking home from the park minding our own business." Daniels froze, the boy's words hitting uncomfortably close to home. He thought of Juliet and how his assumptions had caused so much pain. Taking a deep breath, he turned toward the group. "Can I hear more about what happened?" he asked hesitantly, his voice quiet but sincere. The boys looked at him skeptically, their expressions a mixture of defiance and curiosity. One of them shrugged. "Why do you care?" Daniels met their gaze steadily. "Because I need to understand," he said simply. After a long pause, the boys began to share their stories. They spoke of feeling targeted, misunderstood, and afraid. They described encounters with officers who treated them like suspects before asking any questions. Daniels listened intently, his heart sinking with every word. For the first time, he began to see his own past behavior through their eyes. The shame he felt was overwhelming, but he forced himself to sit with it, to acknowledge it fully. By the end of the conversation, the boys' hostility had softened slightly. One of them, a tall boy with sharp eyes, looked directly at Daniels and said, "You really want to make a difference? Then don't forget what we told you." "I won't," Daniels replied, his voice resolute. As the weeks turned into months, Daniels began to notice a change in himself. His time at the youth center and the training sessions were reshaping the way he saw the world. He started to notice things he had overlooked before, the way people of color were treated in stores, the subtle microaggressions embedded in everyday interactions. One day, while walking through a neighborhood he used to patrol, Daniel saw a group of young black boys playing basketball. His old instincts told him to be vigilant, to watch them closely. But then he caught himself, realizing with a pang of guilt how deeply ingrained his biases had been. He walked over to the boys, a smile tugging at his lips. "Mind if I join in for a game?" he asked. The boys exchanged wary glances but eventually handed him the ball. As they played, the initial tension gave way to laughter and camaraderie. It was a small moment, but for Daniels, it felt like a step toward redemption. Meanwhile, Juliet was taking her own steps toward healing. Though the memory of her encounter with Officer Daniels still lingered, she found strength in the support of her family and friends. One evening, as she sat on the porch swing with her father, Dr. Samuel gently brought up an idea that had been on his mind. "Juliet," he said softly, "have you thought about sharing your story with others?" Juliet looked up at him, her expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. "What do you mean, Dad?" Dr. Samuel took her hand, his voice steady. "Your experience, painful as it was, could inspire change. There are so many people who need to hear your voice." Juliet bit her lip, uncertainty clouding her face. "I don't know, Dad. It's still so hard to talk about." "I understand," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Just think about it, okay?" For days, Juliet mulled over her father's suggestion. The idea of speaking publicly terrified her, but a small voice inside whispered that it might be important. Finally, she made her decision. Early one morning, she approached her father in the kitchen, her voice trembling but determined. "Dad," she said, "I want to do it. I want to share my story." Dr. Samuel's face lit up with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Juliet," he said, pulling her into a hug. A week later, Juliet stood on a small stage at a local community center. The room was packed with people, their faces a mix of curiosity and support. Juliet's hands shook as she gripped the microphone, but she took a deep breath and began to speak. She recounted her experience with raw honesty, describing the fear, confusion, and anger she had felt. But she also spoke of hope, the hope that her story could spark change. "I never thought something like this would happen to me," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I've learned that our voices matter. We can make a difference if we're brave enough to speak up." In the audience, heads nodded in understanding. Some people wiped away tears. Juliet's words resonated deeply, especially with the young people in the crowd. She saw their faces light up with recognition, their own stories reflected in hers. As Juliet stepped off the stage, the applause was thunderous. Dr. Samuel greeted her with a warm embrace, his pride evident in his beaming smile. "You were amazing, Juliet," he said. Juliet smiled back, her heart full. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. In the weeks following Juliet's speech, her story began to ripple through the community, igniting conversations and sparking a collective desire for change. Local leaders reached out to Dr. Samuel, asking him to participate in forums and discussions about racial bias and police reform. Juliet was invited to speak at schools and community events, her courage inspiring others to share their own experiences. At the police department, Captain Edwards worked tirelessly to ensure the changes he had promised were implemented. The racial sensitivity training program expanded, becoming a mandatory part of the department's ongoing education. Officers were encouraged to attend community events, not as enforcers but as neighbors. One afternoon, Captain Edwards called Officer Daniels into his office. "Daniels," he began, his tone firm but encouraging. "How are things going at the youth center?" Daniels hesitated, then smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression. "It's been eye-opening, sir. These kids, they've been through so much. Honestly, I think I'm learning more from them than they are from me." "And the training sessions?" Edwards pressed. Daniels nodded, his expression serious. "Challenging but necessary. I'm starting to see things differently now." Edwards studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "Good. Keep at it. This is just the beginning." Daniels left the office feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He thought about the conversations he'd had at the youth center, the stories that had once made him uncomfortable, but now drove him to be better. That same evening, Daniels returned to the youth center. The building buzzed with the energy of children playing games, working on homework, and chatting with one another. As he walked through the room, a young boy called out to him, "Hey, Officer D, you ready to lose at basketball again?" Daniels laughed, the sound easy and unforced. "Not today, Marcus. I've been practicing." As the night went on, Daniels found himself in a deep conversation with Mr. Santos, one of the community elders. They talked about the history of the neighborhood, its struggles, and its triumphs. "You've changed, Officer Daniels," Mr. Santos observed, his tone thoughtful. "I remember when you first came here. You were different then." Daniels nodded, the weight of the man's words sinking in. "I was wrong before," he admitted quietly. "I saw things in black and white, good guys and bad guys. But now I see we're all just people, trying our best." One crisp afternoon, as the sun began to set, Dr. Samuel and Juliet approached the youth center. It had been months since their last encounter with Officer Daniels, and they weren't sure what to expect. Inside, they found Daniels surrounded by children, helping them with an art project. The scene was so different from their last meeting that both father and daughter stopped in their tracks, momentarily stunned. Daniels looked up and froze when he saw them. Slowly, he stood, his face a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Doctor." "Samuel." "Juliet," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you for coming." As the children scattered for a snack break, Daniels approached them, his posture open but respectful. I can't tell you how grateful I am for this chance," he began. "What I did that day was inexcusable, but it opened my eyes to my own prejudices. Being here, working with these kids, it's changing me." Juliet listened quietly, her eyes scanning the colorful artwork on the walls and the laughter of the children around them. She could see that Daniels had changed, but the memory of that day still lingered, a sharp reminder of the pain she had endured. Daniels seemed to sense her hesitation. "I know words aren't enough," he said, looking directly at her. "But I'm truly sorry for what I put you through. I'm working every day to be better, to make sure no one else has to go through what you did." Juliet took a deep breath, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. "It still hurts," she said softly. "But I can see you're trying. I forgive you." Daniels's shoulders slumped with relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Samuel stepped forward, his tone firm but encouraging. "What you did was wrong," he said, "but I can see you're making a genuine effort to change. I appreciate that. I forgive you too, but remember, this is just the beginning." Daniels nodded solemnly, his determination evident. A few weeks later, the community gathered for a special event at the youth center. The room buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life came together to celebrate progress and unity. Captain Edwards stood at the podium, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He spotted Doctor, Samuel and Juliet in the front row and nodded in acknowledgement. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "We're here tonight to celebrate something truly special, the power of change." The room fell silent, all eyes on the captain as he continued. "Not long ago, our community was divided. There was distrust between the police and the people we swore to protect. But today, I stand before you as proof that change is possible." He paused, his gaze finding Dr. Samuel's. "My dear friend, Dr. Samuel, taught me a lesson years ago. He showed me that compassion knows no color, and that friendship can bridge any gap. It's because of him that I stand here today, leading a department that's committed to doing better." Dr. Samuel felt a lump form in his throat, his pride swelling as he listened. "We've made mistakes," Edwards continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "But we're learning, we're growing, and most importantly, we're listening. Forgiveness is a powerful thing. It's not easy, but it's necessary for healing. I've seen officers transform, just as I did, and I've watched as they've learned to connect with the community they serve." Edwards gestured toward the audience, where Daniels sat among the community members. "This journey isn't over. It's only just begun. But tonight, we celebrate the progress we've made and the hope we have for the future." As Edwards finished, the room erupted into applause. As the applause settled, Juliet stood up from her seat, her small frame trembling with emotion. She made her way to the stage, each step deliberate, her face a mix of nervousness and resolve. The crowd watched her with quiet anticipation, the weight of her story still fresh in their minds. Captain Edwards stepped aside, offering her the microphone. "Juliet," he said softly, "you've shown us all what bravery looks like. Please, share your voice." Juliet took the microphone, her hands shaking slightly. She glanced out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, and took a deep breath. "When this all started," she began, her voice wavering, "I never thought I'd be standing here. I didn't want to talk about what happened to me. It felt too scary, too painful." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor before she raised her eyes again, her voice growing stronger. "But then I realized, my story isn't just mine. It's the story of so many people who feel like they don't belong, like they're not seen for who they really are. I've learned that our voices matter even when it feels like they don't. And tonight, I want to thank everyone who's listened, who's worked to make things better. This is only the beginning, but it gives me hope." The room was silent for a moment before the applause erupted again, even louder than before. Juliet stepped back, her face flushed but glowing with a newfound confidence. Dr. Samuel joined her on the stage, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Juliet nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thanks, Dad." After the speeches, the room buzzed with energy as people mingled, sharing stories and forming new connections. Officers and community members chatted over cups of coffee, the barriers between them slowly dissolving. Juliet found herself surrounded by a small group of her friends, their faces beaming with pride. Jasmine gave her a tight hug. "You were amazing, Jules," she said. "Thanks," Juliet replied, smiling shyly. Nearby, Officer Daniels stood with a group of teens from the youth center. He laughed as they shared jokes and stories, his once guarded demeanor replaced by warmth and openness. Dr. Samuel approached Captain Edwards, the two men shaking hands firmly. "You've come a long way, John," Dr. Samuel said. "So have we all," Edwards replied. "But there's still work to do." Dr. Samuel nodded. "Always." The event ended with a community mural project. A large canvas stretched across one side of the room, and attendees were invited to paint or write messages of hope and unity. Juliet hesitated at first, but then picked up a brush, painting a small flower in the corner of the mural. "What does it mean?" Jasmine asked, watching her work. "It's for growth," Juliet said simply. "For new beginnings." In the weeks that followed, the police department's reforms continued to take shape. The Oversight Committee, now fully operational, became a trusted intermediary between the department and the community. Officer Daniels, now a regular presence at the youth center, found himself transformed by the relationships he had built there. He learned to see the world through the eyes of the children he mentored, gaining a deeper understanding of their struggles and dreams. One afternoon, he stood in the middle of a bustling art class, helping a group of kids create papier-mâché sculptures. "You know, Officer D," Tasha said, her hands covered in glue. "I used to think cops were all bad, but you're not so bad." Daniels chuckled, his heart warming at her words. "Thanks, Tasha. That means a lot." Across town, Juliet continued to share her story, becoming an advocate for social justice. She spoke at schools, community centers, and even city council meetings, her voice a beacon of hope and resilience. Dr. Samuel watched his daughter with pride, marveling at the strength and determination she displayed. "You've turned something painful into something powerful," he told her one evening. "I learned from the best," Juliet replied, smiling up at him. Months later, the community gathered again, this time to unveil the mural that had been created at the youth center event. The completed piece was vibrant and full of life, a testament to the resilience and unity of the neighborhood. At the center of the mural was a tree, its branches reaching out in all directions, symbolizing growth and connection. Among the leaves were the words painted by attendees: hope, justice, love, and change. Juliet stood with her father, gazing up at the mural. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's a reflection of what's possible when people come together," Dr. Samuel replied. Nearby, Captain Edwards and Officer Daniels stood side by side, their faces filled with pride and resolve. "We still have a long way to go," Edwards said quietly. Daniels nodded. "But we're on the right path." As the sun set over the community, its golden light illuminating the mural, a sense of peace and optimism settled over everyone gathered. For Juliet, Dr. Samuel, and the entire neighborhood, this was more than just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a brighter, more hopeful future. Juliet looked up at her father, the warmth of his embrace grounding her. "Do you think things will really change, Dad?" Dr. Samuel smiled, his eyes filled with hope. "They already are, sweetheart. And it's because of people like you." As they walked away from the mural, hand in hand, Juliet felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. Her story had sparked a movement, and though there was still much work to be done, she knew that together they could create a world where justice and compassion prevailed. If you were moved by Juliet's story, the next chapter will leave you inspired. Click here to watch.